Hello World History 1 students, this is Mr. Everton, and this is our second video on the Hebrews and the history of Judaism. In our last video, I told you about how Judaism is one of the world's oldest religions, and it was founded by the prophet Abraham, according to the Torah, which is the sacred text of Judaism. Today we're going to talk about how Judaism spread, and how that is connected to this question. How did a history of oppression affect Judaism? If you don't know what oppression is, that's okay. Many of you might not. Oppression just means a long history of being treated badly, of being treated violently, of being discriminated against, of being taken away from your homeland and forced to live places you don't want to live and do work you don't want to do. And that is what has happened to the Jewish people throughout their history at different points. The most famous example is called the Holocaust. You probably learned about it in middle school. In the 1930s and 40s, the German state discriminated against Jews, took their private property, segregated them, and eventually murdered millions of them. But this is not the first time that the Jewish people were persecuted and oppressed. The Torah describes the Jewish people being oppressed at many different points in their history. One example is their treatment by the Egyptians. According to the Torah, the Egyptians enslaved the Jewish people and forced them to work there for several generations. But then the Torah describes, in the book of Exodus, God intervening on the Jews' behalf and picking a Hebrew named Moses to become a prophet. And through Moses, God leads the Jews out of Egypt, intervenes on the Jewish people's behalf, and fights against the Egyptians for them. And here you can see an illustration of that story with Moses holding his hands up, using the power of God to separate the Red Sea, which is a massive body of water, and allow the Hebrew people to walk through the sea on dry land. So this is an example of God working for the Jewish people when they do what he wants. And then frequently in the Torah, it describes the Jewish people being punished if they do what God does not want them to do. It's shortly after Moses leads the Jews out of Egypt that the Torah describes Moses receiving the 10 Commandments from God. And this is another example of God's intervention. And it's an important point, so we're going to talk about it in a little bit more depth. The 10 Commandments, you may have heard about them, but they are a set of religious laws that are written down in the Torah. And because the Torah is sacred to Christians as well, and also Muslims, it's in the Bible as well. So the Torah is also part of the Christian Bible. And so the 10 Commandments are sacred to both Jews and Christians and Muslims. These laws are based on morality and justice. This is the idea that people should behave a certain way, that there's such a thing as a right way to act and a wrong way to act, and that people should be rewarded for behaving well and punished for behaving badly, and that's how we want to keep society just. This is different from an earlier law code that we talked about. I'm hoping that you remember what the name of that law code is. Gary, yes, okay, Gary, calm down. I understand that you know. Yes, Gary, it is the Code of Hammurabi. I'm glad that you remember that. I hope other students did too. Gary, I hope you'll let other students have a chance to answer sometime. The Code of Hammurabi, if you remember, was very focused on revenge, on retribution, on an eye for an eye, right? So if I do something to hurt someone else, that thing will be done to me. And that is a very crude form of justice, and you could argue that the 10 Commandments have a more elevated version of justice, one that's based on a moral code. So after the Jews leave Egypt and receive the 10 Commandments, they go back to Canaan, they go back to the Jordan River Valley, which is their promised land, according to the Torah, and they set up residence in Jerusalem, their holiest city. And here you can see an illustration of Jerusalem and of the temple that they build to Yahweh, to their God, in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is still a really important city for the Jewish people. It's located in the present-day nation of Israel, which is a nation that is set up. It's predominantly a Jewish nation. It was set up for the Jewish people to live in after World War II in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And it was the site of the original Jewish temple, which again you can see an illustration of here. And the Torah describes how after a period where some kings were ruling the Jewish people very successfully, the Jews were attacked by the Babylonians, and they were forced to go into exile. Their temple was destroyed, and the Jewish people, here you can see an illustration of them being marched out of the city of Jerusalem. This period is called the Babylonian captivity because the people who attacked Jerusalem were the Babylonians. And so the king Nebuchadnezzar, the Torah describes him exiling the Jewish people from their homeland, forcing them to go live somewhere strange and unfamiliar, was a tactic that we know was used in the ancient world by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, by a variety of other people. And it's a way of controlling people. If you take someone and put them somewhere where they're unfamiliar with their surroundings, they'll be less likely to act up and get into trouble. So the Jews lived in Babylon for several generations before they were able to leave and return to their homeland. This is called the diaspora. You can see on the map circled in blue, you can see the city of Jerusalem, and you can see the arrows showing, representing the spread of the Hebrew people across the Fertile Crescent and across the Middle East. And diaspora just means scattering. Because of the exile and the Babylonian captivity, Jewish people were spread against their will throughout the Fertile Crescent. And so you end up with a very small group of people with a very small religion, and they end up all over the Fertile Crescent. And it spreads the ideas of Judaism and monotheism, the belief that only in the belief that you should only believe in one God. It spreads throughout the region and becomes more popular and more well known because the Jewish people are being persecuted. So being oppressed actually helps to spread Judaism. Later, after the Jews have rebuilt their temple, the temple is destroyed again, this time by the Romans in 70 CE, so much later. I'm jumping forward in time. But throughout history, people have they sort of wanted to pick on the Jews because the Jews refused to bend to other people's will. They're so focused on their belief in one God, and they won't deny their belief in one God. And the Romans would say to the Jews, like, all you have to do is just accept that the Emperor Augustus is a god too. And the Jewish people refused to do that, and they would rebel and try to free themselves from Roman rule, and that led to the destruction of their temple. And it led to a further diaspora, a further scattering of the Jewish people throughout Europe. And so through this oppression, the Jewish people were able to spread their religion to new places. And that is what has made Judaism a truly world religion. Much later, Judaism, as we talked about before, Jewish people became oppressed by the Germans in the 1930s and 40s, and that in turn is what led to the establishment of Israel in the Middle East, a nation for Jewish people, and also it led to many Jewish people fleeing Europe to the United States, and that is why, as you can see on this map, today most Jewish people, about 5 million live in Israel, 5 million live in the United States, and then there are many other Jews scattered throughout the rest of the world. And here you can see the Western Wall, which is located in modern-day Jerusalem. You can see it's a pilgrimage site. It's a place of great religious significance that Jewish people still go to this day in order to pray. And the reason why it's so important is because this is believed to be the original wall, an original wall that was part of the original temple. It's the last remaining structure of that original temple in Jerusalem. So to summarize, I forgot to put a picture on here. Come on, Everton, get it together. To summarize, Moses was a Jewish prophet who led the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt. He also received the 10 Commandments from God, which were a religious law code. And later, the Jewish people would be exiled from their city of Jerusalem, and they would be scattered across Mesopotamia, across the Fertile Crescent, and later throughout Europe, which is called the diaspora. Thanks very much for watching, and I will talk to you next time.